It is my pleasure to have Professor Kenneth Joseph with us to speak about his work on multiple social identities from Twitter bios. Dr. Joseph is an assistant professor in computer science and engineering at the University of Buffalo. Prior to joining the University at Buffalo, he was a postdoc at the Network Science Institute at Northeastern University and graduated from the Societal Computing program at the Carnegie Mellon University. He identifies as a computational social scientist and is primarily interested in developing ways to measure and model how social inequality arises and is maintained with a particular focus on the United States. So with that, I turn it over to Dr. Joseph. I also request everyone else to keep your microphones muted. And if you have any questions during the talk, please use the chat feature. And of course, we will have the discussion phase after Dr. Joseph's presentation.
All right, thanks, Naveed. Thanks, Nitin. I was looking at my slides we were talking. So, right, there we go. Can people see the main screen? All right, cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Kenny. I'm going to talk about a paper that we wrote for CSCW last year, entitled "The Method to Analyze Multiple Social Identities in Twitter Bios." So before I get started, a quick nod to Arjun Pathak, who is a former master's student here at UB, who's now at Amazon, was the lead author, and Naveed, hopefully this is an okay picture of you. If not, I think I gotta get another one, although I like it. So Naveed is on this call. He's a first year student here, working with me at UB. So they did the lion's share of the work. Okay, so this talk has the phrase identity in its title. That word means a lot of things to a lot of people. So I want to be clear on what I mean by identity, which is in sort of the traditional social psych sense of the words and phrases that we use to label ourselves and others. And these identities are important because they tell a very rich story about who we are, right? So currently I am holding the identity, or you could assign me the identity, right? Presenter, and you all are sort of like implicitly assigned the identity audience member. And one story that tells about you and me is it explains our behavior, right? The reason that I am just like sitting here talking admittedly to a screen and you are maybe checking email, but also listening is because of the identities we hold here. So identities are important because they can help explain our behavior, and they, for what it's worth, can do that because they have really strong culturally shared meanings, often labeled as stereotypes. I'm not going to talk so much about what identities mean today, as much as I am trying to think about like, what are these words and phrases, what aren't they, and what can we say about that? Okay. So the other thing I want to do is kind of caveat what I just said. It's not necessarily that the identities we hold explain our behavior. It's the identities we choose to present in a particular social context that are telling the story about us, right? So right now, in this context, I am a presenter. Later on, I will be a dad or a father, and ultimately, lately for the 4-year-old, a short order cook. So I think you're supposed to not give them the food that they want, but I don't know, he doesn't eat, so I do what I can. This is really important in the context of social media, right? Because who we present on social media, of course, is not necessarily the self that we are offline. And so it's necessary to kind of caveat everything I say with that observation. So I want to state that up front. Okay, so identity is important because it can help to, for example, explain behavior, but there's also a ton we don't really understand about identity, right? So we can ask questions like, why do we present certain identities in certain contexts, or who gets to be what identities, right? And what structural constraints exist to prevent a certain person from being able to take on a particular identity, okay? And so my interest in social media and studying identity is that it's a very rich source, where on some social media, not all, but some social media, people present their identities to us in a relatively structured way. Okay, so there's two key parts here. One is that we get to see something about their identities. The second key part, which is really the talk today, is that it's only relatively structured. So actually, we have to do quite a bit of work conceptually and methodologically to pull out meaningful signifiers of social identity, right? But if we can do that, and I think we can, then we get to have sort of this dual win in some ways, where we get to use social identity both to better understand from a social science perspective what identity is, and also we can use those identities to understand user behavior, right? So like a quick example, here are two tweets, one of which I think you could align with my identity that I present there as a father, and the other that makes a lot of sense in my identity as a professor, right? And so the identities that I have there could have helped to predict this behavior, this tweet that I sent, but also you could imagine that we could use the tweets that people send to better understand identities. And so there's kind of like both, we can use social media data to do both of these things, which is really exciting. Okay, so the challenge, as I alluded to, is that actually determining which identities people are presenting on social media is really hard. Okay, and there's a couple of different reasons why it's hard. I'm going to sort of flag two. One is, well, what counts as an identity, right? So here's AOC's Twitter bio. This first part in blue, right? She says she's a U.S. representative in New York District, the 14th District of New York, parentheses Bronx and Queens. Okay, so from there, what exactly am I pulling out as like a single identity versus like different identities that she's trying to present, right? So where is like what counts as like one identity? Okay, so that's one challenge. The second challenge is, what do we do with information where there's clearly a signal to an identity, but you can't identify, you can't label the term as the sort of canonical version, canonical definition of identity, which is a label that someone is applying to themselves or someone else, right? So when AOC says she's 100% people funded with no lobbyist money, she's signaling an identity. This is identifying information, but it isn't in and of itself what we want to call a social identity in social psych. Okay, so this paper is all about trying to address these challenges. What we do is first we define this concept of a personal identifier, right? And the high level here is that we're going to give up on trying to only pick out identities from bios and take a slightly more general concept of personal identifiers, which is roughly like things that signify an identity. Okay, so once we have this concept, or in reality, actually, as we're developing this concept, we're also developing a method to extract these personal identifiers from Twitter bios. Okay, and then the final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you in a variety of ways, and even more in the paper, that this concept is reliable and valid, and that the method we have to extract it is like good enough to do the job. Okay, so I'll stop here. Nitin, is it okay if I stop here for any questions, or should I keep going? I'm happy to do either.
We can certainly, yes, we can certainly stop and see if we have any questions.
Okay, so I'll stop here. If folks have any questions, I'm happy to talk to you.
It's actually better to keep it interactive.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. But if no one has them, I'm happy to continue also. So I'll pause for a minute.
Yeah, and you're what you're talking about here, and you may get into this, but you're talking about the concept of more of a personal identifier versus when we think of like social identity. I mean, are we going to be getting into the social identity aspect, or is this more of the kind of labeling of the identifier?
Okay, so that's a good question. I would say personal identifiers are signals of social identity. Okay, I think that will address, I think, yes, maybe in a couple of slides they'll address your concern, but like a social identity is like the label, and personal identifiers are phrases people use that signify one of those labels. So I think we will be talking about social identity, Billy.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Okay, so I'll get into this. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is like what a personal identifier is, and again, and sort of how we got there. So again, like the general idea here is that it's really hard to pick out these ways in which people are labeling themselves that fit the canonical definition of a social identity. Okay, and so we're going to back out and say, okay, well, here are some words and phrases that seem to signal personal identity, and we think those are useful too. Okay, so the way that we came to this was qualitatively. So we coded in the qualitative coding sense. We started coding whole bios. Okay, and the most important part of that was sort of quickly seeing that people were delimiting their bios in very specific ways, right? So they were chopping up their identities in these bios into different segments that we could sort of parse out into separate phrases or ways they were thinking about themselves. So, and Michael Yoder's on this call, and Michael's work on Tumblr really influenced how we thought about this as well. So, in his work, he identified a bunch of delimiters, and essentially we ended up doing the same thing, right? So we constructed, so once we identified this notion that we should split up the profile into a bunch of different segments, then we began this iterative process, which kind of helped us to develop our method and to develop this concept of a personal identifier. Okay, so the first thing is like, let's construct a regular expression that like cuts on, let's say, periods and commas and those like long slash things that I don't actually know what they're called. Right, so split out bios into using those different delimiters. And then on those subsets of bios, do qualitative analysis to say, well, what are these things that we're extracting? What do they look like? What can we do with them? Okay. And once we came to both a definition of that, like what was interesting at the start, and what was not, and how to split the bios, we did some sort of validation. So usually that validation amounted to some measure of iterative reliability. And we just iterated this process over and over and over, improving the regular expression, improving this concept of what we wanted to extract from bios, and validating until we had convergence in the validation metrics. Okay, so this process gave us both like how we were going to split up the profile bios, which was a huge part of our method. And it also gave us this concept of a personal identifier, which basically is like, what are the things that are valuable to extract from bios. Okay, and then after we did all this, again, we sort of, I just want to emphasize that like our validation was not like within this iteration. It was once all of this was done, then we began our evaluation of our method. Okay, so this is kind of how we did this, how we defined a personal identifier. Here is like the formal definition, which is by and large, let's pull out things that signify social identity. And importantly, also for us was, I don't need any additional context. And I'm pretty sure that the identity that it's signaling to me is the same identity that you meant to show or you meant to display. Okay. And so actually, I think it's beneficial here, before I show you things that are personal identifiers, to show you things that are not. Okay. So here are three phrases that we that showed up in profiles that we thought were not personal identifiers. So hugging is like something that you might do that signals something about you, but it would be really hard, I think, to determine like what specific identity, what specific label you would apply to yourself or to anyone who has hugging in their profile. And so like we would need sort of additional information, or this is like too vague to fit like one specific label. Similarly with the term God. So it's clear that this person is signaling religion, but it's not clear like which specific religion. Okay, so this was actually an edge case. I think this was a one that we went back and forth on, but ultimately this fell into the, I need more context. Okay, and the final one is formerly, and of course, right, formerly means something. So they did something before, but formerly what, right? So formerly on its own is not just like a way we identify, or it doesn't even signal anything we might identify with. Okay, so those are like not personal identifiers. And then here are 5 ways that we saw social identity being expressed that we did label as personal identifiers. So of course, like if people had identities in their profile, and they often did, we want to count those as a way of personally identifying, as identifying. Also preferences. So a lot of people said things like, I love basketball. To us, that signaled sort of directly the identity basketball lover that a lot of other people have in their profiles. Personal descriptors. So people said, I am old. We thought that it was reasonable that that's an identifier or a signal of the identity old person. People often had like affiliations to political or social groups, like hashtag Bernie 2020, which signifies the identity Bernie supporter. And actions, not like hugging, but like hooping, that sort of specifically imply a particular identity, in this case, a basketball player. Okay, so I'll stop again here for questions or concerns.
Just one question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, Billy, you can go ahead, please. Yeah.
Okay, real quick. I know you mentioned like the context. You don't need context. You mentioned briefly in the paper just like these tough cases where the person actually like interpreting that might need some context. So like go blue for Michigan or something like that. How did you kind of draw the line there? Like would it kind of like be, you know, what a reasonable like person, or I'm not sure how you did that.
Yeah. So that's another really good edge case. So who needs the context? And of course, the underlying piece there is like who the annotator is something that I don't think, frankly, we figured out. Like, I think you have to, like, again, our quote unquote algorithm, which I'm going to show you this in the next slide, which is extremely simple, like it has a perspective, right? So like the algorithm itself has like a cultural perspective. I think that would ultimately define whether or not go blue is a personal identifier or not. And I think that is hard to say with such a basic model. Like if we trained it on annotations, you could say, well, like all the annotators had the US cultural context. So like our model should do, and that's how we're defining context. Here, I think it's like pretty vague and open for like future work. I don't know if that answers your question, Michael.
Yeah, I was just curious. I'm kind of, well, also how did you decide that for annotators? Was it just like if the annotator understood that reference, they would mark that, and then
yeah and so okay. I think it was important, right? So I am raised in the US cultural context. I also went to Michigan for undergrad, so like go blue was like a very salient example of like, I think it was Naveed even, who was like, this is someone's talking about a color, and I'm like, no, actually for better or worse, that's like a very clear signifier of like this niche, and so actually that's why we wrote about it in the paper, because I don't think we have an answer to how to do that, but it's clear that it's a problem that can only be solved by defining the cultural context in which you're going to claim context.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, thanks.
So yeah, I have one question actually. Forgive me if I missed that part. So here we are extracting the identities and labeling them, and I'm trying to understand how it is helpful in what part of the social media if we extract those identities and label them. Could you please help me understand?
Yeah,
I think you're going to explain that later, but I was just curious by seeing your slides.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say like, okay, well, like why, and certainly we got this in some of our reviews. Michael, I don't know if you saw this in yours too, like, well, okay, why are you doing this? So like part of our evaluation is like, I'm going to try to convince you that there's a reason to do this.
Dr. Scott hasn't responded to my email yet. Then I said,
okay, cool. So thank you for those questions. Those are great. All right, so here now we've defined like what we want to pull out. How do we actually do that? And again, this is the method. I will emphasize that the key here is that it's very, very simple. So I think there's a lot of room to grow here, and you could do some interesting like distance supervision or like any number of things. But for us here, because we were sort of introducing a new concept as well, we thought it was important. And I will note that the reviewers on this paper were awesome. And I think we were cued by the reviewers on this to try to keep this sort of methodological piece simple. And so all we do is like, again, we split on the delimiters that we identified in the prior step. And then we do some like basic cleaning. So like we remove the phrase like I am et cetera, et cetera. And then we filter out some like obvious non-cases. So like things with excessively long phrases, we noticed were almost always not anything meaningful, and so on and so forth. Okay, so it's basically a glorified regular expression with some cleaning and filtering. So once we have this tool, I just want to show, so now that we have this tool, right, I just want to show some output to show like the flaws in the tool, right? But also sort of the utility, right? So here's my bio, here's the bio of Biden. And it's pulling out like things that we might want it to pull out, like he, him, studying people with computers, those seem reasonable. Vice versa, probably something we would not want. For Biden, husband to is separated from like who he is the husband to. Maybe we want that, maybe we don't, right? And tweets may be archived, clearly we don't. But 46th president of the United States, like that's probably the thing, the main thing that we would want to pull out. Okay, so this thing seems like, well, maybe it kind of works. It pulls out some useful stuff, pulls out some stuff that's not useful. So like, all right, clearly we need to at least have some estimate of how it does. So in the last, 10 or so minutes here, I'm gonna talk about this evaluation, and we evaluated quite extensively. So I'm gonna show like a couple of things here, and it's like a subset of what we did in the paper. And the goal was to assess validity of the concept and the method, but also, as was pointed out, right, we're going to try and show it's useful too, and then also we're going to look a little bit at generalizability, right? So I'm going to show 3 different ways that we try to address validity, utility, and generalizability. The first is manual annotation, and we use manual annotation for inter-rater reliability to evaluate the validity of the concept, and then accuracy of this method, right? So we pull out a bunch of things, pull out a bunch of like phrases within bios and code them manually for whether or not they're personal identifiers. Okay. The second thing we're going to do is compare how people with different demographics and different levels of status as marked by Twitter, how their personal identifiers vary. And we're looking here both at convergent validity, like do identifiers we should expect to match certain demographics actually match those demographics, and also discriminant validity. So again, like discriminant validity addresses this question here of like, well, does it tell us something above and beyond demographics that's useful? That's also sort of the context in which we evaluate utility. So I'll show a quick like clustering example and talk about why we think these things are useful. Okay, so here is the data we use for this evaluation study. The first 2 data sets, which I'll call panel 1 and panel 2, are data sets of Twitter users that have been linked to voter registration records. This is data that I helped and continue to help collect at the David Lazer's lab. And I can talk about that linking process and the ethics of that linking process in the Q&A. But these are just 2 different snapshots of the profiles of those users in those panels. And then the second thing is just like essentially a purely random sample of Twitter users. And this is the more interesting generalizability question. I think we learned a lot of things actually just by these like basic comparisons of the panel data and the random data. But to preface some of our results, the random sample is like not unexpectedly like less human-y, less professional, because we've had to, the people in the panel had to have like their real names presented and their real locations presented. Okay. So that's the data we are going to talk about. Most of the work was applied on this first panel data set. Okay, so manual annotation, if you remember, we used to look at inter-annotator agreement, the reliability of the concept, and accuracy. So our results on agreement, we labeled a bunch of different subsamples of this data, and like the agreement levels were somewhere between, in terms of Cryptonorth's alpha, between like 0.6 and 0.8. So the takeaway here is like, we eventually got to a concept of personal identifier that's pretty robust, that we think can be applied and used by other scholars with a reasonable definition of what it means. The second piece is accuracy, right? So if so we took a couple hundred phrases that have been extracted from bios, and we said, well, what percentage of them in these 3 different data sets are personal identifiers? Okay, and so the main takeaway here is like the majority of them are, the vast majority for the panel data sets, not necessarily the vast majority for the random sample. Okay, so like in this data set, this panel data set where we are pretty certain that we're looking at people, this thing performed pretty well. On the random subset, it performed less well. I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the random profiles do, I think, look a little different, like I said, than the panel profiles. And so I think some tweaks would be needed or something really fancy. The other thing, though, is I think basically a study design flaw. So we extracted from the random sample both English and Spanish profiles, and then restricted our annotation to not label anything in a foreign language as a personal identifier unless we directly knew the translation. And so that's the reason why this green dot, which is observations we labeled unclear, is like quite a bit higher for the sample. So I think like it's not as good in the random sample, but it's potentially not as bad as it looks here. Okay. But again, it's a simple method. I'm not trying to defend or claim that like there's not ways to improve it, but like I also do think that you know, I think this thing is useful on most Twitter data sets kind of as is. Okay, so switching over to questions about convergent validity. So basically, again, this is, does this thing kind of do what we would expect when we compare it to demographics or to other things? I think by and large, the answer is yes. So over here, the plot young dash old. So the x-axis here is the average age of users with this phrase in their profile. And we're showing like the top 10 oldest phrases and the top 10 youngest phrases. And so keeping in mind that this is registered voters, so the youngest individuals have to be, had to be age 18 when we constructed the panel. I think this is like a reasonable case, like all of the younger people have like markers to what school they're in. And all of the older people had to have, all of these older things are, you know, retired or emeritus, etc. One important point here, just like on privacy, like none of these, I think all of these had to be in at least 10 or 20 profiles. So I'm not telling you who is in our bio just by virtue of showing our data set, just by showing you these. Okay, the other one is status. So basically the green here, I'm not going to describe the x-axis in detail. But I can say that's the log odds of followers to friends. So people who have higher values here have more followers than they do friends on Twitter. And so these are the top 10 personal identifiers for people with higher, what we're calling status here. And these are the bottom 10. Okay, and I think like just looking up here, like again, I think it sort of checks out face validity wise that we're seeing what we would expect. Here now is discriminant validity, which I think is slightly more interesting, which is like, well, are we seeing anything above and beyond what we can do with, let's say, demographics here, right? And so I do think that the gist on this plot, again, so here the x-axis is what's the log odds of someone with this this identifier in their profile being a Republican versus a Democrat, right? And so like, I do think we're seeing that there are, of course, different kinds of Republicans, different kinds of Democrats, and we can sort of bury in and say a little bit more than just this person's a Democrat or this person's a Republican if we use these sort of more narrow personal identifiers. Okay, the same thing in white versus Asian here. Asian means only one thing on the demographic data that we have, but of course, Asian, this sort of broad Asian identity means a lot of things to a lot of people, and we can see again here like what specifically it means to be Asian to certain individuals. Okay, and I'm going to show in a couple of slides that I think actually not only does this help us understand who we're looking at better, but I think it can help predict behavior better as well. Okay. So the final thing we did was we looked at how these personal identifiers clustered. So the high level is like two identifiers clustered to the extent that they tend to show up in the same profiles. Okay. Here's like a list of all the interesting clusters we found. And this is like a pretty diagram of it. I don't know, I just think it's super pretty. I'm not sure it's meaningful. But I wanna just drill down to these three, because I think if you read through these, so each chunk here, these are three separate clusters. And I think if you look at these, and this is gonna be a very informal statement, I'm happy to discuss it. Like if you look at these, to me, these kind of like make sense together. These identities just like feel like they go together, right? I think the last two are interesting in that they feel like they make sense in clusters, but they're both like presentations of gender. And so one thing that I'm hopeful for, and I'll talk about this in the next couple slides, is that we can use this tool to start to think about the ways that people combine identity across contexts, even though this is within Twitter, right? So Twitter forces us to collapse contexts, to collapse our circles, which means we get to see identities that people place across like institutions, across different kinds of boundaries. And so we can, via clustering, start to think about like how people tend to pick out identities across institutions, across contexts, which like from a social psych perspective is really hard to do because typically we only get to observe people in like a very a specific niche context. Okay, so question. Oh, okay. Last couple slides, like where are we headed now? So one of the things that our method doesn't do, either theoretically or methodologically, is say like, well, when do two personal identifiers mean the same thing, right? And so I think that's actually a really hard conceptual question that I don't have an answer to. Like, is a father of two the same thing as a father of two boys? Well, like, maybe. What about like father of two and dad of two? I don't know, again, kind of, but you're not both of those things, right? You make a decision to say you're a father of two or a dad of two. And like, I don't really know how to parse out like what that choice means. So that's one thing we're thinking about. A second thing we're thinking about is like, of course, we've all seen like how people, or maybe not, but people are trying to use word embeddings to look at like the dimensions of language, right? And so like, if you take words of vec and you try to look at what are the most similar words in the embedding space to the word mom, you get the most similar phrase is dad, right? So you could do some tweaks here to like, you know, find the gender direction, as people call it in the embedding space. But like, this is like, anyone who is a mom is not likely to call themselves a dad, right? And so I think if you look at trying to extract a very similar similar measure of similarity in a similarly constructed embedding space using the profile data, you get like other phrases that we think better align with mom. And so starting to think about like this concept of like similarity between people as being distinct from semantic similarity, which is what word vectors try to encapsulate, is really interesting for us. So that's like more on the social psych side. On the practical side, right? So here is just like the personal identifiers. So we put like personal identifiers into a regression to predict fake news sharing very quickly, right? This is a pretty informal analysis, and we can see how like we can start to, right? So the canonical knowledge, as far as I'm aware, is like it's older right-leaning adults that share misinformation, but like I think we can drill down much further when we think about them. Okay, so those are some of the places that we're thinking about going with some of this work. With that, I will conclude, and happy to chat and take questions, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. That was fantastic. And I think we have some questions in the chat. I believe we have addressed most, but the most recent one from Michael is how is the bio-based similarity model or space constructed?
Yeah, so it is, you are just doing like bios, personal identifiers as the rows, and the columns are users, and then Naveed just ran Word2Vec on it. So it's like literally the same thing.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's like relying on the similarity of users that use those terms.
Yep, exactly. Like co-presence in. So it isn't. Yes. Yeah. That's all I'll say. It's just yes.
Cool. Yeah, this is awesome work. I had a couple other questions. So I guess like looking at some of the divergent validity things you were showing was really interesting, and also in the clusters, I guess it's sort of like the cluster sort of made sense, like you said, but sometimes they weren't strictly sort of categorized by how usually social scientists sort of divide up these identities, like these, like, I don't know what to call them, dimensions or categories, what have you, like gender or race or religion. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on what you're kind of seeing there, that sort of from the bottom up, if there were groupings that were different from that were interesting, that we should kind of know about as more of like at least computational social scientists.
Yeah, I mean, for me, dating back to my time in Dr. Kiley's lab, like that's been the real question of, I think there are other sort of more, it's the most interesting theoretical question, like what is it? Those, like I said, those make sense together. If I asked you, if we did some sort of like intrusion task, right? Like you would be able to figure it out, but like exactly why you would be able to do that, I don't have a good sense. My view would be that they are similar on some dimension of perception about people, but what? So that's a hypothesis, right? Of course, maybe, of course, I don't know, but like how we characterize that dimension, like, we're turning now to a data-driven way of characterizing that dimension, which is really exciting. I just don't know how to do it theoretically yet.
Okay, yeah, it's like some sort of latent thing that it's really hard to grasp. And then I also just wanted to ask, at least when we were doing kind of a little bit of similar things on Tumblr, we were actually finding that, kind of looking back at that work, there were lots of personal identifying info, or not like personal identifier sort of things. Like people were presenting their identities in lots of places on their profiles outside of the text bio box. I kind of have the feeling that on Twitter, this is maybe a little less so. So on Tumblr, like usernames often had a lot of information on, like, you know, yeah, Star Wars fan, lover, whatever. And then also photos. So I don't know did you have annotators look at any of that information, or did you kind of, while you were going through stuff, look at that information?
Yeah. And Naveed, you can comment if I'm wrong. I think mostly we had focused on the bio, and we're trying to think about how we might go beyond that. Naveed, did we think about that at all more than I'm thinking about, if you're here? Okay, so I think the short of it is like, no, we didn't really go beyond it, but like it'd be really interesting too.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
If I may ask a question, and this is very, very interesting work, and we can see so many implications to it. In marketing, business, political communication, ad campaigns, and many much more, right? So I'm wondering, I have two thoughts. One is, have you thought of how time plays a role in the evolution of these social identities? That is the first question. And is this possible to model that evolution of social identities at a macro scale? The other question that I have is, let's say if someone takes the findings from your research and starts to build a predictive or machine learning model for folks, let's say you have their declarations on their bio, and then their inferences based on their declarations. And of course, much of this is done based on what is represented in these large data sets. Sometimes these could feed into biases of those algorithms, and those algorithms may perpetuate those biases or amplify certain biases. So do you see any consequences or concerns in that regard? So these are the two thoughts.
Yeah, that's both awesome questions. In terms of the temporal evolution, there's been a little bit, so like as we were, as we and Michael were developing some of these ideas, there's another person, Jason Jones at Stony Brook, who was thinking a little bit about this. I think he has some work that I can share with the group on how certain specific identities have evolved over time. And I think so he's trying to check and looking how identities and profiles change in response to, for example, pride events, how that changes the way that people place pronouns in their bios. And so like, I think you can think about one thing, which is like, how do people's bios respond to events? I think the war in Ukraine and the prevalence of like Ukrainian flags in people's bios is like a good example. But there's another version, which is like, how do individual bios evolve like over the life course, which I think is really interesting. Fred Morstatter has been thinking about that with his group, trying to look at like what people are willing to put in their bios at different time points. But yeah, suffice to say, I think it's really interesting to look at, and it's one of the avenues that I'd be super curious to see people exploring. The second piece about bias, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a question of like, it's hard to think about like what the algorithm is that would, okay, so maybe I'll take your question in a particular way. Just like, let's come up with a marketing context where like people are going to use these labels to only target their marketing towards a specific kind of person. We have a pretty lengthy section in the paper about this, and we went back and forth on it for a while. I think my justification to myself, and whether or not this is like a valid justification, I think is worth a discussion. And you can challenge it. But I think my justification is we're not really, ultimately what we're doing is glorifying regular expression. And so for me, it's more like conceptually showing that what people put in their profiles has meaning, but like we're not adding any labels to people beyond what they've labeled themselves already. So it's not like we're doing any kind of like, let's say, gender inference, which I think is problematic for various reasons. But just like kind of chopping up their profile labels. So like whether or not that's actually better, it's hard to say if I just convince myself of that or whether or not it is, but that's sort of our rationale.
So certainly, thank you for your thoughts. I was curious when I saw a mention of word she or her in the bio leans more towards Democrats than conservatives. So those type of labelings, could that feed into unfounded biases, and perhaps a predictive modeling type algorithm could feed from that bias and perpetuate it even more. You know, so that's the direction I'm coming from. But of course, this is we're not predicting that. It's just a matter of what the data is showing.
But that's a really good point of like, you have to be really careful about like, and admittedly, right, like people can take our methods and do what they want with them. And so, so it's a concern. I think it's so important, of course, to remember like that we're looking at how people are presenting themselves, right? And once you say like, okay, Democrats are more willing to present their pronouns on Twitter, then it makes a lot of sense. But like you're saying, if you just take that and like, oh, we can do gender inference using this tool, then that's like going to be problematic in a number of ways. So yeah, that's a really good point that I admittedly had not thought about until you said it. So I'll have to take that back and chew on it.
I think that presents an additional line of work for Naveed, perhaps. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts. Let's again go back to the floor, see if we have any question.
I have a question. Kenny, some of my work, I'm looking at collective action and connective action, and I'm wondering if you took if you've looked at any data where users have participated in some kind of movement or protest, a larger event, and maybe work backwards and identify those users and see if their personal kind of self-labeling identifies with maybe some of those events that they're participating in, or if those events maybe influence a change in kind of that self-labeling. Does it align? In other words, the people that identify a certain way maybe have participation in certain types of events, or if they can change.
Yeah. The only thing, so the closest we've come to that, Billy, the short answer is no, we haven't. The closest that we've come is we're doing some work trying to look at supporters of Bernie Sanders. This is a very different realm, but like supporters of Bernie Sanders during the 2020 DNC. And we use this approach in combination with some other approaches to try to identify a group of Bernie supporters. And all I can say anecdotally is like, in looking at the people who we identified as Bernie supporters based on like that cluster of people in the social networks, many of them had hashtag Bernie 2020 in their profiles. They all, or the vast majority of them, seem to be Bernie supporters. So it's not like people seem to be using these things to like co-opt support, but like as true signals of who they think they are. And I think like in combination with the social network, I think these can be useful signals for, group identity. Yeah, that's the high level answer.
That's good. Yeah, because I think that's some of the work that I'm doing is looking at it more from that other side. So I think they certainly complement each other pretty well.
Definitely.
Wonderful. Let's see if we have just one more question. And if not, that's totally fine too, because we do have a couple of announcements. So again, thank you so much, Kenny, for doing this presentation. As you can see, it's not usual that we have so many questions, discussions throughout the talk as well as after the talk. So thank you again for doing the presentation. Now, I also would like to invite everyone here to visit our SBP BRIMS website. We have the annual conference on social computing, behavioral cultural modeling, and prediction. That's going to be held from September 20th to 23rd this year, and the call for papers is out. So if you have research you would like to submit, go ahead, please check out our call for papers. We also have doctoral consortium, which is actually led by Professor Joseph. So if you have doctoral students, you are a doctoral student or a graduate student exploring research, please check the call for papers or call for submissions for the doctoral consortium on the website. There will be student scholarships. So if you are traveling or you will participate in the conference, then your registration costs will be certainly waived by the scholarships from the conference. Everything is available online. Go check out the website, please. And we will also disseminate the call for papers and more information through our mailing list. And thank you again, everyone, for joining.
Hey, Nitin, you might want to mention the challenge problem.
Yes, thank you, Kathleen. We do also have a challenge problem like last year's, although the challenge problem is a bit different this time. We are looking at the COVID-19 problem and how COVID-19 has changed the policy and so on in the healthcare sector, communications, public policy making. The data set that we will be using will be the Delphi study from the Carnegie Mellon Research Group, the Delphi group. So please take a look at the challenge problem section on the website. As always, we give awards to the best submission in the challenge problem, and the best submissions also get invited for a special issue at the CMART journal that is led by Dr. Kathleen Carley. So there are a lot of other information on the website. Please go check out the website, and I encourage everyone to submit your work or your students' work, encourage them to submit their work. And again, thank you everyone for joining us this morning for the cybersecurity working group.